If a man has traveled the world, tasted the finest food, had the ear of presidents, and the love of millions, why would he hang himself alone in a hotel room, days before finishing what should have been another triumphant episode? Was it heartbreak? Was it shame? Or was it something far deeper, far more uncomfortable, something most of us don't want to look at, especially in ourselves? Anthony Bourdain's death wasn't just a headline, and it wasn't just a tragedy for food lovers. It was a sharp, sobering mirror held up to modern life, to fame, to masculinity, to how little we understand about mental health in men, even those we idolize, especially those we idolize. Welcome back to Celeb Shadows TV, where we don't just tell you what happened. We ask why it happened, what it means, and what it reveals that others prefer to keep in the dark. If you believe that the most powerful truths are the ones no one wants to say out loud, you're in the right place. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, because today, we're not just revisiting the life and death of Anthony Bourdain, asking the questions no one dares to ask. And you might not like all the answers. Let's begin. He was the man every middle-aged American wished they could become: opinionated, rebellious, well-read, and effortlessly cool. Bourdain wasn't a trained journalist. He wasn't a celebrity chef in the traditional sense. But he was one hell of a storyteller, and stories, as we know, are more powerful than credentials. With a fork in one hand and a cigarette in the other, he gave us a window into cultures, into kitchens, and into chaos. And maybe that's what made his ending so unthinkable. Because if he wasn't happy, who could be? But let's stop right there. Was he ever truly happy, or were we projecting happiness onto him because we needed him to be? That question, as painful as it is, might be the only way to understand the man who went from heroin addict to household name, only to end it all when everything seemed to finally make sense. Because in reality, very little about Anthony Bourdain's life actually made sense. He grew up surrounded by books, music, and culture. His parents were far from negligent. Yet by the age of 12, he was experimenting with LSD. Not long after, he fell into heroin. He didn't become a star because of that pain. He survived it, but barely. And unlike the Hollywood redemption stories we love so much, Bourdain's struggle never truly ended. He just got better at hiding it. We all watched him evolve from bad boy chef to global documentarian, from bar-hopping rebel to Obama's dinner companion in Vietnam. But behind that evolution was a man constantly running from failure, from addiction, from intimacy. And that running eventually led him to Asia Argento. Now, before we go further, this isn't a finger-pointing exercise. We're not here to vilify or canonize anyone. What we're doing is peeling back layers of a public narrative that has long been simplified to "he was sad because she cheated." Because that's not just lazy, it's insulting. To him, to his legacy, and to every man or woman who's ever lived through silent depression while putting on a brave face. But we do need to talk about what really happened between them. Because whether or not it caused his death, it undeniably colored the final chapter of his life. Asia was many things: a filmmaker, a survivor, an activist. She was outspoken, defiant, electric. She was also deeply complicated, just like him. When they met, it seemed like fire meeting fire. But fire, as we know, doesn't just light up a room. It burns. And for Bourdain, it burned quietly, internally, until there was nothing left. Their relationship, by all accounts, was passionate but unstable. They were long distance, often separated, both carrying heavy emotional baggage. When photos surfaced of Asia with another man in early June 2018, the internet exploded. Tabloids swarmed. Fans speculated. And somewhere in a French hotel room, Bourdain, already stretched thin from a grueling schedule, already battling exhaustion, made a decision. But what was that decision really about? To answer that, We need to look at more than just one relationship. We need to look at his entire pattern. His first wife, Nancy, adored her, but fame pulled them apart. His second wife, Octavia, had a child, but distance killed the intimacy. Every woman in his life gave him something beautiful, and each on eventually left him feeling isolated. But was it their fault? Or was Bourdain simply unable to stay? The deeper we go, the more we find a man obsessed with motion. Planes, trains, kitchens, wars, street food stalls. She kept moving, because when he stopped, the silence got too loud. And that silence, my friends, is the villain of this story. But it's not the only one. Stick with us as we unravel what happened in the days leading up to his death, the choices that haunted him, and the truths that even his closest friends struggled to say out loud. Because when you strip away the fame and the quotes and the cool jackets, what's left is a man who never stopped being a boy searching for a place to belong, even if he had to build it with a camera crew and a bottle of wine. He wasn't born into chaos. That's the first thing worth noting. Anthony Bourdain came from a stable, even cultured background. His father, a classical music executive, his mother an editor at the New York Times. He was a product of intellect and taste, not trauma or neglect. And yet, by the age of 12, he was chasing acid trips like candy. So what happened? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the better question is, why do we expect dysfunction to always come wrapped in tragedy? For Bourdain, the dysfunction was quieter. It grew in the cracks between privilege and boredom, between comfort and curiosity. He wanted edge. He wanted danger. And when he didn't have it, he created it. He followed his high school sweetheart, Nancy, to college. That decision shaped the next 2 decades of his life, but it also exposed his distaste for pretense. He dropped out, walked away from academia, and enrolled at the Culinary Institute of America. At the time, it was a shocking choice. To his parents, it might as well have been a prison sentence. But for Bourdain, kitchens were chaotic enough to feel alive. After graduating, he moved to New York City, took up restaurant jobs, and slipped deeper into a lifestyle that was less bohemian and more self-destruction dressed as rebellion. Drugs weren't just recreation, they were routine. He cooked while high. He scored between shifts. He told friends that only 1 in 4 addicts ever got clean. Looking around a cab one night, he realized there were 4 of them. That was the moment he chose to be the one who survived. But survival didn't mean sobriety. It meant functioning just enough to keep the wheels turning. When heroin started to sink him, he switched to methadone. When methadone didn't fill the void, crack took its place. One Christmas, he was so broke he laid his record collection on a blanket and tried to sell it on the street for drug money. And then somehow climbed out. He clawed his way into higher-end kitchens, even if the businesses around him were failing. He was charming, intelligent, restless, but he was also barely staying afloat. Restaurants came and went. Jobs dissolved. Paychecks vanished into debts. But the writing, that was different. Late nights, hungover mornings, stolen hours in between kitchen shifts. She wrote first essays, then a manuscript, a behind-the-scenes expose about the raw, real, grimy underbelly of restaurant culture. He called it Kitchen Confidential. The essay that sparked the book landed in the New Yorker thanks to a favor from his mother. Without her persistence, without her belief that her son's writing had something true to say, it may have never reached the public. But it did, and the public devoured it. It was the kind of success that doesn't just change a life, it upends it. Almost overnight, Bourdain went from chef to celebrity. Book deals, TV offers, speaking gigs, they came in waves. For the first time in his life, he had money, real money, and for a while, it looked like the classic redemption arc, drug addict turned success story. But that's Hollywood thinking. Real life is messy, eh? Because while the world was celebrating Bourdain's rise, his marriage was collapsing. Nancy had stood by him through decades of obscurity, of drugs, of dead-end jobs. But fame rewrote the rules. He traveled constantly. Interviews replaced intimacy. Airports became his address. Eventually, they drifted apart, separated, and divorced in 2005. It broke him more than he admitted. He tried to stay upright, tried to find meaning in work. His shows, first a cook's tour, then No Reservations, then Parts Unknown, took him across continents, through war zones, into back alleys and five-star kitchens. But something else was happening too. Bourdain was becoming the voice of a generation who didn't trust the polished, who didn't care for fluff, who wanted grit. He gave it to them, unapologetically. And yet, even as he gave the audience what they wanted, he kept running. From grief, from guilt, from himself. In 2006, while filming in Beirut, he found himself caught in an actual war zone. Israel launched airstrikes. The city burned. Bourdain and his crew huddled in a hotel, watching through windows as lives were shattered. They were eventually evacuated by Marines. And though he survived, the images haunted him. It was a turning point, not because it was traumatic, but because it made everything else feel even more performative. Shortly after, he met Octavia Bija, a restaurant hostess with a sharp wit and a fighter's spirit. They moved fast, got matching tattoos on their second date. Within a year, they were married, and she was pregnant with his daughter, Ariane. For a brief moment, Anthony Bourdain seemed content. Not happy, never quite that, but grounded. Parenthood changed something in him. He still traveled, still filmed, still wrote. But he spoke of Ariane as an anchor, a reason to come home. But the old pattern returned. The more successful he became, the more absent he was. He filmed over 250 days a year. The camera loved him, but his family missed him. And when Ariane started school, Octavia couldn't join him on the road anymore. The distance grew. Communication frayed. By 2016, they separated. Another marriage gone. It's important to understand these weren't cold-hearted exits. Bourdain wasn't a villain, but he was a man haunted by motion. Stillness frightened him. Commitment, in the long term, felt like confinement. He wanted to love, but he couldn't stay. After the separation, he met Asia Argento. And while their relationship deserves its own deep dive, and it will, what matters here is the timing. He was fragile. She was fiery. And just like every chapter before, it began with passion and ended in silence. By the time 2017 rolled in, Bourdain was rich, famous, creatively fulfilled, but emotionally exhausted. The cracks were showing. He began pushing himself harder, promoting cookbooks, directing episodes, making travel plans, giving speeches. He took on too much, said yes too often, and in the quiet spaces between the noise, his demons crept back in. After one episode in France, racked with physical illness, overwhelmed by fatigue, he blacked out in a doorway after taking medication on an empty stomach. The scare forced him to write a long, sorrowful email to his first wife, Nancy, a kind of apology, a reflection, a farewell. He didn't stop working. He didn't stop loving. But the shadow he had carried since childhood, the one dressed in addiction, abandonment, and self-loathing, had never really gone away. It had just gotten better at hiding behind success. And it was about to return with a vengeance. There's an old saying that behind every great man is a great woman. But in Anthony Bourdain's case, there were several women, and each relationship told a different story about who he was, who he wanted to be, and who he feared he truly was. Let's start with Nancy Putkowski. Nancy wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't in the limelight. She wasn't even someone Bourdain spoke about often in public. But she was, for over 2 decades, the most consistent presence in his life. She was his high school sweetheart, the rebellious older girl he followed to Vassar. Their early days were wrapped in drugs, wild nights, and youthful defiance. But as the years went on, it became something else: a quiet endurance. Nancy was there when he had nothing, when he was bouncing between failing restaurants, when his idea of luxury was a cold beer and enough rent money to get by. And yet, the very thing that had kept them together for so long, survival, began to erode when Bourdain finally tasted success. When Kitchen Confidential blew up, their life together shifted. The old routine, the comfort of obscurity, the messy but private intimacy they shared, it didn't fit the new mold. He was traveling, being interviewed, wooed by producers, audiences, and publishers. Nancy, who had stood by him through addiction and poverty, found herself drifting behind a curtain. They separated quietly. There was no scandal, no tabloid frenzy, just distance. In 2005, they finalized the divorce. And for all his boldness on screen, Bourdain barely spoke of it. He once admitted he was bereft. That's all he could say. Then came Ottavia Bija. If Nancy represented the wild, bohemian youth, Ottavia was the next chapter, a woman with her own fire. She was a former MMA fighter, sharp, grounded, and unafraid to push back. They met in a restaurant he frequented. On their second date, they got matching tattoos. Within a year, they were married and had a daughter, Ariane. Ottavia gave Bourdain something he hadn't had in years: purpose beyond himself. He spoke openly about fatherhood being the greatest thing that ever happened to him. Ariane wasn't just his daughter, she was a lifeline. For a while, he found stability. They shared a home. They traveled together. He found joy in simple moments: breakfast with his family, watching cartoons with his kid. But the work always came first. Not out of selfishness, but out of habit. Bourdain had spent decades hustling, clawing for relevance, drowning in the fear of becoming irrelevant again. So when producers called, when opportunities came, he said yes, again and again, until 250 days a year were spent somewhere else. On a plane, on a shoot, in a hotel room. Eventually, Ottavia stopped following. Ariane started school. A real life needed roots. And Bourdain, no matter how deeply he loved his daughter, couldn't plant them. In 2016, they separated. Not out of anger, but exhaustion. And just like with Nancy, Bourdain didn't fight. He faded away, too tired to ask life to slow down. Then, as if pulled by fate, he met Asia Argento. This is where the story gets controversial. Asia was an Italian actress and director, fiery, bold, politically outspoken. She had her own demons, her own scars. She was one of the first women to accuse Harvey Weinstein publicly, becoming a face of the Me Too movement. For Bourdain, who had long despised institutional abuse and hypocrisy, her strength was magnetic. They became a couple in 2017, and the chemistry was immediate and intense. Friends described them as deeply in love, but they also described volatility. Asia was based in Europe. Bourdain was always moving. Their relationship was long distance, unconventional, and by their own admission, open. Now, open relationship is a phrase that tends to spark judgment. But let's put that aside. What matters here is that whatever arrangement they agreed to, it was still laced with emotional vulnerability. Bourdain, despite everything, was a romantic. He wanted to believe in loyalty, in connection, and maybe, just maybe, he struggled to live by the very openness they agreed to. When paparazzi photos emerged in June 2018 showing Asia with another man, holding hands and kissing in public, it triggered something. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was public. The private world he had with her, flawed, fragile, real, was suddenly plastered across tabloids. The entire internet weighed in. People accused her of betrayal, of breaking him. It's not that simple. Asia later said they had an understanding, that he had also been with other people. That what hurt wasn't the act, it was the shame, the spectacle. And perhaps that's the truest thing she ever said about their relationship. Anthony Bourdain lived for raw truth, but he died under the weight of public scrutiny. Then there's Eric Ripert, the quiet one, the confidant, a world-renowned French chef and Bourdain's best friend. Ripert was the yin to Bourdain's yang, calm, meditative, spiritual. They traveled together often, and it was Ripert who was with him during his final days in France. When Bourdain missed dinner one night, Ripert thought he was tired. When he missed breakfast, he went to check on him. He was the one who opened the door, who found the body, who made the calls, who held the silence. Ripert never blamed anyone. He never lashed out. But his grief was palpable, because if there was anyone in the world who might have seen the signs, it was him. And he didn't. Finally, Jimmy Bennett. Most viewers won't recognize that name immediately, but his connection to Bourdain is key to the final twist of this story. Jimmy was a former child actor who, in 2018, accused Asia Argento of sexually assaulting him when he was 17. The timing? Just months after Bourdain's death. The bombshell wasn't just the accusation, it was the fact that Bourdain had allegedly paid Bennett a $380,000 settlement on Asia's behalf to silence the scandal. That detail changed everything. Because if true, it meant Bourdain, a champion of survivors, a vocal supporter of Me Too, had used his own money to suppress a story of alleged abuse. No one knows exactly what he felt. Shame? Confusion? Betrayal? All we know is that his silence on the matter was deafening and uncharacteristic. For a man who built his brand on calling out hypocrisy, the contradiction must have been unbearable. These relationships, Nancy, Ottavia, Asia, Ripert, and even Jimmy, weren't just footnotes. They were pieces of a puzzle. Pieces Bourdain spent his life trying to fit together, only to realize too late that some edges never align. Each person saw a different version of him. The lover, the father, the friend, the fixer. But maybe the saddest truth of all is that no one, perhaps not even Bourdain himself, ever saw the full picture. What do we really know about a person's final days? What parts are truth? What parts are speculation? And which parts are projections, things we want to believe because the alternatives are too uncomfortable to accept? In Anthony Bourdain's case, there are more questions than answers. And the most haunting thing about his death is how quickly people tried to fill those gaps with easy narratives. But nothing about his final days was easy. Nothing was straightforward. Let's begin with the obvious, the paparazzi photos. It was early June 2018 when images surfaced of Asia Argento holding hands with a French journalist in Rome. The photos spread like wildfire across social media. Accusations followed. Betrayal, infidelity, humiliation, it was all implied, but rarely confirmed. Fans of Bourdain were quick to blame her. The narrative became painfully binary. She broke his heart, and he couldn't bear it. But here's the issue with that narrative: it ignores context, complexity, and most importantly, Bourdain's own agency. Yes, he was reportedly hurt by the photos. Yes, their relationship was intense and emotionally charged. But this wasn't a teenager reacting to a breakup. This was a 61-year-old man with decades of emotional scars, a long history of depression, and a deep well of internal conflict. To say he died because she cheated is not only inaccurate, it's an insult to the deeper pain he carried for years. And yet, that's exactly how public discourse treated it. Asia became a villain overnight. She was labeled a narcissist, a manipulator, a heartbreaker. The internet, as it so often does, chose simplicity over truth. She didn't help her case. Either her public mourning was, at times, confusing. In one post, She quoted the song, "You Know I'm No Good" by Amy Winehouse. In another, she lashed out at people who criticized her grief. It felt disjointed, but grief often is. Behind the headlines, a more troubling detail began to emerge: the scandal involving Jimmy Bennett. In August 2018, just 2 months after Bourdain's death, the New York Times reported that Asia had been accused of sexually assaulting Bennett when he was 17. The twist? Bourdain had allegedly paid the young man $380,000 to prevent the story from going public. If that's true and the paper provided receipts, then it raises a profound contradiction. Bourdain was one of the earliest and loudest celebrity voices in support of the Me Too movement. He condemned predatory behavior. He publicly called out chefs like Mario Batali and other powerful men in the food industry. He was unwavering until the issue hit too close to home. Was he protecting Asia? Was he silencing a victim? Was he conflicted, compromised, or simply overwhelmed? We don't know. What we do know is that the timing was devastating. He died before the news broke. But it's fair to ask, did he know the story was coming? Was he struggling with the pressure of what he had agreed to do morally, emotionally, publicly? And if so, was it a tipping point? People close to him say he was increasingly erratic in his final weeks. More withdrawn, more exhausted. He wasn't sleeping well. He was filming, promoting, juggling. He had stopped doing things he once enjoyed. One friend noted that he didn't want to go scuba diving anymore, something he had once loved. These small details often escape notice. But in hindsight, they form a pattern, a dangerous one. His final episode, filmed in France with Eric Ripert, was never aired. It became too painful, too intimate. What was caught on camera is unknown to the public. What happened off camera is a void that can only be filled with speculation. But one thing that was confirmed: in the days leading up to his death, Bourdain was texting Asia. Some sources claim the conversations were tense. Others say he was angry about the photos. But no messages have been released. We are left, once again, with shadows and silence. And into that silence, the world poured its assumptions. Some believed he was heartbroken. Others believed he felt betrayed, not just by her, but by the image he'd crafted. He was a man who told the truth, who stood for victims, who had rebuilt himself from addiction. And yet, if the reports are accurate, he had also become a silent participant in hiding abuse. That contradiction, if it existed, must have eaten away at him. It would have forced him to ask himself the question he had so often asked of others: who am I? Really? Let's also not forget his long struggle with mental health. This wasn't sudden. Bourdain had spoken candidly about depression before. He had joked darkly about death, about ending it all. In one interview, he described once being so drunk and sad during a trip to the Caribbean that he drove toward a cliff, intending to go over. A song on the radio changed his mind at the last second. This wasn't the first time he had considered checking out. The pressures of fame didn't help. He was on the road constantly, asked to be on for cameras, interviews, fan interactions. He was stretched thin. The expectations were immense. The grief of 2 failed marriages, the ache of missing his daughter, the emotional weight of war zones and poverty-stricken countries, all of it compounded. And maybe, in the end, it just got too loud. When Eric Ripert found him, Bourdain had missed dinner, then breakfast. A simple, mundane red flag that turned into a final chapter. The man who had spent his life telling others' stories had ended his own without explanation. And that's where the deepest unease lies. There was no note, no warning, no public message, just silence. What do we do with that? How do we process the loss of someone so articulate, so present, so outwardly vibrant when they vanish so suddenly, so quietly? Some say suicide is an act of despair. Others say it's a moment of impulse, a flash in the dark, But in Bourdain's case, the build-up was long, and the pain, though hidden, was always there. And maybe that's the hardest truth to accept, that even when someone seems like they've made it, when they have purpose, a career, a child, love, adventure, it might still not be enough. Because the war isn't always outside. Sometimes, it's the one inside that wins. To understand Anthony Bourdain's death, you can't just examine a single event. It wasn't a love affair gone wrong. It wasn't a scandal that broke him. And it certainly wasn't a one-time emotional collapse. It was something far more insidious, a lifetime of tension between who he was and who the world wanted him to be. That tension never left him. It just got quieter. As his fame grew, so did the distance between his public image and private struggles. He was seen as fearless, bold, unshakable, a traveler of dangerous places, a truth-teller with a cigarette and a sharp tongue. But behind that confidence was a man who never truly found peace and stillness, who often talked about feeling like an outsider in his own success. The contradiction wasn't subtle. He made his career by being brutally honest, but he couldn't always afford to be honest about himself. There's this widespread idea that Bourdain was the guy who had it all figured out. A modern cowboy, eating his way through the world, one philosophical monologue at a time. But the truth is, he often hinted at how much he felt like he didn't belong anywhere. He once said he was happiest in motion, always moving, always chasing. But chasing what? Stability? Forgiveness? Escape? Whatever it was, it always seemed just out of reach. In many ways, Bourdain represented a kind of masculinity that's revered yet deeply flawed. The rugged, weathered man, quietly brilliant, emotionally detached, but romantic when it counts. The type of man who drinks alone, who solves problems with work, who loves fiercely but always with a ticking clock. But here's the danger with that archetype. It teaches men that their worth lies in how much they can endure without breaking. And Bourdain endured a lot. Childhood drug addiction, failed marriages, isolation from his daughter, an exhausting travel schedule, the mental toll of filming in war zones, poverty-stricken communities, and places steeped in trauma. He brought light to those stories but carried the darkness home with him. He wasn't just a man under pressure. He was a man constantly negotiating between two worlds, the romantic ideal and the emotional truth. The version of himself that people praised and the version that cried quietly in hotel rooms with no one to call. Even his relationship with Asia Argento followed that pattern. From the outside, it was passionate, unconventional, and intense. But underneath, it was layered with complexities no one fully understood. When those paparazzi photos went viral, it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about exposure. It was about losing control of the one thing Bourdain valued most, his dignity. And maybe, after everything he'd survived, it wasn't the heartbreak that broke him. Maybe it was the feeling that his life was no longer his own. There's also the elephant in the room, the moral conflict he might have faced after arranging that settlement with Jimmy Bennett. Whether it was to protect Asia, or to avoid further public chaos, the act itself stood in stark contrast to the principles Bourdain had championed. He had spent years calling out hypocrisy, defending survivors, demanding accountability, and now may have helped suppress a story. Imagine the internal fallout from that. A man who fought so hard for truth, possibly compromising it for love. It doesn't take much imagination to see how that might haunt someone already carrying so much weight. And yet, what makes this even more tragic is how normal his experience was in one specific way. Like countless men, Anthony Bourdain struggled to talk openly about pain. He could reflect on global issues, criticize institutions, make us all think differently about culture and politics. But when it came to his own emotional needs, his own fear sheet often shut the door. He wasn't alone in that. Many men are taught early on that emotions are liabilities. That vulnerability is weakness. That asking for help is a last resort. So they learn to smile through sadness, joke through trauma, and overwork through emptiness. It's not surprising that Bourdain found himself in that exact cycle. He kept filming, kept flying, kept performing, because the moment he stopped, he might have had to confront just how tired he really was, how many regrets he carried, how loud the silence could get when there was no camera rolling, no script to follow, no city to explore. That silence is where depression thrives. And for someone like Bourdain Simeon, who gave the world so much, it's almost unbearable to think that, in the end, he felt he had nothing left to give. But maybe he didn't need to give more. Maybe he needed to receive support, understanding, grace. That's where we, as a society, failed. Not just him, but men like him. The ones we put on pedestals without checking if they're steady. The ones we admire for their strength while overlooking their fragility. The ones who never say, "I'm hurting," because they were taught no one wants to hear it. And maybe Bourdain believed that, too. That his pain didn't matter. That his suffering was self-inflicted. That the world would keep turning without him. But that's not true. His death left a void. Not because he was famous, but because he was human, flawed, conflicted, and desperately trying to hold it all together. Just like so many others. In the end, Anthony Bourdain didn't leave a note. No last words etched into paper. No final message typed on a screen. Just silence. And in that silence, the rest of us were left to piece together a story that didn't end neatly, or clearly, or completely. But maybe that's the most honest ending of all. We often look to death for answers, as if it's the final sentence in a well-structured narrative. But death, especially by suicide, is rarely a clean punctuation mark. It's more like an unfinished sentence, interrupted mid-thought, surrounded by pages we'll never get to read. And with Bourdain, those unread pages feel particularly heavy. He was more than a celebrity, more than a TV host or an author. He was a mirror, one that reflected back not only the beauty and complexity of the world, but also the quiet, aching truths we try to ignore. He showed us how to connect, how to listen, how to approach people with curiosity instead of judgment. But he also showed us, without meaning to, how even the brightest lights can cast the darkest shadows. That's where the conversation should live, not in blame, not in gossip, not in romanticizing the tragedy, but in reckoning with what his life and death actually reveal about us. We celebrate people like Bourdain because they seem fearless. They do what we dream of, leave it all behind, explore the unknown, break free of expectations. But in doing so, we forget to ask the more uncomfortable question: what does it cost to live that way? What toll does it take on a person to constantly be moving, performing, creating, explaining, leading? He wasn't running towards something. He was often running away. And the farther he went, the harder it became to turn back. And then there's the question of silence, the silence that follows after someone like him is gone. A silence not just filled with grief, but with avoidance. Because when someone dies by suicide, we don't just mourn. We squirm. We retreat. We look for a single cause, a single name, a single scandal, anything to make it simpler. But Bourdain's story isn't simple. It's the story of a man who was globally admired but quietly overwhelmed, who built a career on revealing uncomfortable truths but struggled to speak his own, who helped others feel seen, but didn't always feel seen himself. It's also a reminder that even the most insightful, self-aware, compassionate people can carry unbearable burdens, and that charisma, intelligence, and empathy are not shields, theory, sometimes camouflage. We live in a culture where emotional pain is often hidden behind accomplishment, where men, especially, are taught to show resilience instead of vulnerability, where being tough is praised, and asking for help is seen as weakness. Anthony Bourdain embodied that contradiction. He had all the markers of strength, and none of the space to fall apart. And yet falling apart is human. It shouldn't be a private shame. It shouldn't require tragedy for us to talk about what it means to feel empty, even when everything looks full. That's where the real conversation begins. Not just about Bourdain, but about the fathers, brothers, friends, and colleagues in our own lives. The ones who always seem okay. The ones who are always making others laugh. The ones who've been through worse and always bounce back. The ones we never think to ask, "Are you really okay?" Because we assume the answer. But here's what Bourdain's life teaches us. Assuming someone's okay is not the same as knowing they are. And perhaps that's what makes his death feel so haunting. Not just because we lost a voice that mattered, but because we never quite knew how to listen to it fully. Not until it was gone. There's also a cultural weight to this story that deserves attention. We're obsessed with performance online, on screen, in life. We applaud honesty, but only when it's polished and packaged. We romanticize pain, but only when it ends in triumph. And when it doesn't, when it ends in tragedy, treat it like an exception, rather than a reflection. Bourdain was never a myth. He was a man who carried the weight of his past, the pressure of his present, and the uncertainty of his future. A man who tried, in so many ways, to outrun his demons, not for glory, but for peace. And maybe that's the most important truth we can hold on to. That behind every person we admire, there is a private world we may never see. A world filled with contradictions, unresolved questions, and quiet battles. So what do we do with that truth? We don't flatten it into clickbait. We don't weaponize it to shame others. We don't reduce a life like Bourdain's to a headline or a cautionary tale. Instead, we let it open our eyes to the people around us, to the signs we overlook, to the systems that teach silence, to the conversations we've been too afraid to start. Anthony Bourdain lived loudly, but he died in silence. That silence is now ours to break. Not with noise, but with understanding. Not with pity, but with presence. Not with easy answers, but with better questions. Maybe the most haunting part of Anthony Bourdain's story isn't how it ended, but how familiar it feels. A man who seemed to have everything: the career, the respect, the reach, yet still carried a silence none of us heard in time. A man who gave voice to the voiceless, but couldn't always speak for himself. A man who wandered the world to make others feel less alone, while quietly wondering if he'd ever feel the same. What does it say about the world we live in? That someone so admired, so connected, could still vanish into the quiet without warning? Maybe this isn't just a story about one man's fall. Maybe it's a mirror asking us to look at who we idolize, what we ignore, and how little we truly know about the people we think we understand. Because sometimes, the ones who seem the strongest are the ones breaking the hardest. And the ones who make us feel seen are often the ones fading in the background. So the question lingers, not to accuse, not to simplify, but to awaken. How many more will we lose before we finally learn how to truly listen? Thank you for watching this far, and for being willing to look beyond the headlines. Don't forget to subscribe to Celeb Shadows TV so you never miss a truth that others might try to bury. Take care of each other. We'll see you next time.